Welcome to the History Maps podcast. We are examining a comprehensive collection of historical records, textile analyses, and court documents to explore the deeply intricate world of Ottoman clothing. This is part of our History of Clothing series. This deep dive is tailored specifically for you, the listener, to unpack how fabric and tailoring in the Ottoman Empire function as far more than mere fashion. We will trace how a society used clothing as a strict social code, a diplomatic weapon, and ultimately the visible battleground for modernization and political reform.
Yeah, I mean, the material evidence from the period reveals a society where visual identifiers carried life or death consequences. We're really analyzing a system where the exact width of a sleeve or, the specific chemical dye used on a pair of leather shirts.
Or even just how a piece of linen was wrapped around a head, right?
Exactly. That could determine a person's entire trajectory. It dictated whether someone possessed absolute imperial favor or, in some cases, whether they were targeted for execution by the state.
So to understand how a pair of shoes could literally lead to an execution, we have to understand the architecture of these garments from the ground up. Because before there were heavily regulated silk robes in the Topkapi Palace, there was a highly practical utilitarian baseline.
Right.
We have to start with the pastoral nomadic heritage of the Central Asian Oghuz Turks, long before the establishment of the centralized empire in Istanbul.
Well, the initial garments of the Oghuz Turks were engineered exclusively for survival and mobility. I mean, the environment of the Central Asian steppes and later the varying climates of Anatolia dictated the construction.
Because if you're a nomadic warrior, restrictive clothing is just a physical liability.
Exactly. Daily life required a constant movement, primarily on horseback. So this environment necessitated the creation of the two foundational layers of early Ottoman dress. And these were worn identically by both men and women, the shalvar and the gumlik.
Let's examine the physical mechanics of those two items. If a person is riding a horse for 12 hours a day across a cold steppe, they need garments that manage friction and temperature. The shalvar are essentially baggy trousers, gathered tightly at the ankle.
Yeah, and the construction of the shalva addresses several physical challenges of equestrian life. Tight fabric across the thighs or knees will chafe against the saddle.
Right, and it restricts blood flow.
Exactly. It'll eventually restrict blood flow to the lower extremities during long rides. By cutting the trousers with an immense amount of excess fabric, a pocket of air is created around the legs.
Which acts as insulation.
Yeah, it acts as an insulating layer against the freezing winds. Furthermore, gathering the voluminous fabric tightly at the ankle ensures the garment doesn't ride up the calf or get caught in the stirrups.
And sitting right above the shalvar is the gumleg.
The gumleg functioned as a loose-fitting chemise or shirt, typically cut from breathable materials like linen or raw cotton when available.
And it just hung over the torso, right, extending past the waist.
Right. Its primary function was to serve as a barrier between the skin and the heavier, rougher outer garments made of wool or animal hides. It absorbed sweat and oils, protecting the outer layers, which were far more difficult to wash.
So the baseline of Ottoman clothing is purely about surviving the elements and functioning on a horse. But as the centuries progress, and the empire establishes a massive sedentary capital in Istanbul by the 16th century, this utilitarian baseline evolves.
It does. We see these same basic garments retained, but they are built upon until they form a rigid, highly regulated architecture, particularly for women inside the palace and the urban centers.
Because the physical environment changed from the open steppe to the enclosed, highly observed spaces of the palace and the urban courtyard.
Exactly. Consequently, the clothing evolved into a highly structured modular system. We can detail the specific layers of female clothing in 16th century Istanbul by looking at the strict order of composition.
It began with the don, right?
Yes, the don, which served as the innermost trousers or underpants. Directly over the don went the gumlik. But in the urban elite context, this chemise was no longer just a sweat barrier.
It became something else.
Right. It was often woven from fine cotton or silk and featured long, trailing angel wing sleeves that extended past the hands.
Well, if the gumleg has long trailing sleeves, we have already abandoned the nomadic utility. I mean, you cannot easily cook or work with sleeves dragging past your fingers.
No, you can't. And over this fine chemise, the sources indicate the addition of the zvim.
And the zibin is what, exactly?
It served as the primary casual inner robe. It was an ankle-length garment, often opening down the front, and it was the standard attire for domestic life. If a woman was within the private quarters of her home, just with her immediate family, the zumen was the outermost visible layer.
Providing warmth and coverage while
Um,
still allowing for movement?
Exactly. But if she is receiving guests or stepping out of that private family sphere, she adds the formal layer, which brings us to the kaftan.
The formal dress robe.
Yes. The kaftan was constructed from heavier, more luxurious fabrics than the zuban, often featuring rich embroidery or brocade work. Over the kaftan, a belt or a wide fabric sash was wrapped around the waist to cinch the multiple layers together.
Giving it a structural silhouette.
Exactly. And finally, if the woman was stepping entirely outdoors into the public sphere, or if the interior spaces were particularly cold, an overcoat was required. This could be a short, fitted jacket called a yelek, or a heavy, full-length overcoat known as a feres.
So we are looking at a system of 6 distinct mandatory layers. The don, the gumlek, the zibun, the kaftan, the belt, and the overcoat. And the historical records emphasize a strict rule of non-duplication within this system.
The modularity was absolute. A woman in 16th century Istanbul never wore 2 zibuns, nor did she ever omit a base layer. The layers functioned sequentially.
So you couldn't just throw on a kaftan by itself?
Definitely not. Wearing a kaftan without the supporting structure of the zibun and gumlek underneath was a severe breach of protocol. This sequential system allowed for vast combinations of different textures and colors without ever altering the fundamental, heavily layered silhouette.
But let's examine the logic behind this. If these garments trace their lineage back to practical horse riders, how did wearing 6 heavy layers of fabric become the standard for indoor life? I mean, the physical utility of insulation against a winter step is no longer necessary in a sheltered palace.
Well, the physical utility was replaced by a deeply ingrained cultural and spiritual utility. Searing was no longer a defense against the weather. It became an aesthetic and spiritual metaphor deeply rooted in Islamic art and theology.
Like representing a structured divine order.
Exactly. The visible complexity of the clothing mirrored the complexity of the universe. Furthermore, this heavy layering served a highly specific social function. It thoroughly disguised the physical contours of the human body.
Which ties directly into the legal and cultural norms of Islamic modesty.
Right. The heavily layered Ottoman silhouette achieved the requirements of modesty by entirely muffling the physical form. For men, this relates to the concept of ara, which mandates covering the body from the navel to the knee as a baseline.
And for women?
For women, the concept of haya requires much more extensive coverage to preserve modesty and maintain social boundaries. By wearing 6 sequential layers of loose-fitting, heavy fabrics, the body itself was erased from public view.
The human form just became a structural scaffolding to display textiles. To ground this in a specific historical reality, we have a detailed eyewitness account from 1599. Thomas Dallam, an English organ maker, traveled to Constantinople.
Aye.
He was on a major diplomatic mission to present an elaborate self-playing organ to Sultan Mahmud III on behalf of Queen Elizabeth I.
And Dallam's account is a really detailed historical record because he gained access to areas typically sealed off from foreign observers.
Right. While he was working inside the Topkapi Palace setting up the organ, a court dignitary secretly allowed him to look through an iron grill into a private courtyard. Dallam recorded watching the women of the harem playing with a ball.
And what did he observe?
He noted they wore little bonnets made of a golden yellow material. He described seeing fine cotton trousers, the shalvar, and noted the fabric was woven so delicately that he could perceive the skin underneath. He detailed tunics of red or blue, and most notably, he described them wearing velvet buskins, which were elevated pieces of footwear standing 4 to 5 inches high.
Yeah, so Dallam is documenting the private indoor variations of the layered architecture we just outlined. Because these women are within the heavily guarded private sphere of the harem, they are wearing the zumban and the shalvar without the heavy external kaftans or overcoats.
And the sheer cotton really highlights how those nomadic garments changed.
Right. His observation of the extremely fine sheer cotton reveals how the base nomadic garments had been transformed by access to elite, highly processed textiles.
But the 4 to 5 inch velvet buskins highlight how impractical this elite clothing had become. If you're wearing footwear that elevated, you are restricted to slow, deliberate movements.
The elevated footwear, often a variation of bath clogs known as nalin, or these velvet buskins, served a dual purpose. Practically, they kept the hems of the expensive silk trousers and tunics elevated above the damp floors of bathhouses or the dust of courtyards.
And socially,
Socially, altering the physical gait of the wearer to a slow, measured pace signaled high status. Rushing or running was associated with servants and laborers.
So, having established the foundation of these garments, we need to explore how the empire's elite utilized this layered architecture. Inside the Topkapi Palace, clothing was transformed from a modesty requirement into an instrument of absolute authority. The court operated as a highly visible theater of power.
It really did. And the scale of textile consumption within the Topkapi Palace requires examination to understand its function. We are not looking at large personal wardrobes. We are looking at an industrial scale operation. Records indicate that sultans and their children would wear up to 30 different outfits in a single month.
A completely new, heavily layered outfit for every single day. The logistics of producing that volume of clothing must have required an entire sector of the economy.
It required a massive, dedicated labor force known as the El Hiref, or the Community of the Talented. The palace ateliers housed thousands of artisans, weavers, dyers, and tailors whose sole existence was to meet the daily consumption demands of the royal household.
Just keeping up with the shoes alone.
Yeah, the records concerning footwear highlight this volume. Royal children residing in the palace were issued 10 new pairs of shoes every month. The constant production and discarding of luxury goods demonstrated that the empire possessed inexhaustible resources.
And the ultimate expression of those resources, the central garment of imperial power, was the kaftan.
The kaftan worn by the Sultan was the primary visual anchor of the empire's wealth. Its construction was highly specific. It was a T-shaped garment, widened significantly below the waist by the insertion of triangular panels known as pish.
But the critical element of an imperial kaftan, the design choice that communicated absolute authority, was the sleeves.
Yes, the sleeves on these specific kaftans extended all the way to the floor. They completely covered the hands and dragged on the ground.
From a mechanical standpoint, wearing sleeves that long completely incapacitates the wearer from performing any basic physical task. You cannot open a door, you cannot feed yourself, you cannot hold a pen.
And that deliberate incapacitation is the function of the garment. By encasing his arms in floor-length sleeves, the Sultan was signaling to the entire court and to foreign dignitaries that he was completely removed from the physical toil of human existence.
Just a visual declaration that he relies entirely on servants.
Exactly. He relies on a vast network of servants and officials to interact with the physical world on his behalf. The garment forces the body into a posture of static, unapproachable command.
But the Sultan didn't just wear these kaftans. He actively used them to manage his government and handle foreign relations. This was executed through the tradition of hilat.
The practice of hilat, which translates to robes of honor, was a central mechanism of Ottoman statecraft. The administration did not rely on paper certificates, medals, or titles alone to reward service.
They gave out custom clothing instead.
Right. The Sultan gifted highly specific, custom-made kaftans to grand viziers, military commanders, and visiting foreign ambassadors. The exact specifications of the kaftan, the density of the silk weave, the complexity of the gold embroidery, and crucially, the type of fur lining used, such as sable versus ermine or fox, were mathematically calibrated.
Calibrated to their rank.
Yes, to correspond to the exact rank and current favor of the recipient.
So receiving a robe of honor is essentially a public wearable contract. It is a real-time indicator of political status.
It functioned as an immediate, visually broadcasted contract. When a foreign ambassador entered the court and was presented with a heavy silk brocade kaftan lined with sable, every official in the room instantly understood that the ambassador's nation was currently highly valued by the Ottoman state.
The robe dictated how that ambassador would be treated by the rest of the bureaucracy. But what if an official or an ambassador was denied a robe?
The refusal to grant a hilat, or the deliberate gifting of a kaftan made of lesser quality fabric than the recipient's rank demanded, was a severe and public diplomatic insult. It instantly signaled a complete fall from grace.
The whole court would know immediately.
Exactly. The entire court would know that the individual was no longer protected by the Sultan's favor. In the Ottoman system, fabric functioned directly as political currency in consequence.
The state also utilized the architecture of clothing for deep spiritual and protective purposes, particularly regarding the Sultan's physical safety. The archives contain detailed records of talismanic shirts.
Yes, talismanic shirts occupy a unique space between clothing and weaponry. These were specialized inner garments, usually made of fine white cotton, heavily inscribed with specific Quranic verses, complex geometric patterns, and coded numerical grids.
And the production was heavily controlled, right?
Highly controlled by court astrologers and religious scholars. The spinning of the thread, the weaving of the cloth, and the actual application of the ink could only occur during specific, astrologically calculated hours of the lunar cycle.
We're talking about garments designed to alter physical reality. The belief was that wearing this specific shirt, under armor or under a kaftan, would physically protect the Sultan in battle or cure illnesses.
The state invested heavy resources into these shirts because they provided spiritual armor. The ink used was often formulated from the soot collected from the oil lamps inside mosques, mixed with rose water.
So the belief in their efficacy was absolute.
It was. They projected the idea that the Sultan's rule and his physical body were protected by divine intervention.
This level of meticulous control over the meaning of clothing extended to the mechanics of imperial succession too. When a sultan died, the clothing of his successor was immediately regulated to manage the transition of power.
The transition period following the death of a sultan was highly volatile. To maintain order and signal the appropriate solemnity, the new incoming sultan adhered to a rigid mourning dress code.
What were the rules for that?
Well, during the 5-day official mourning period, the new ruler was legally restricted to wearing kaftans strictly in black, dark blue, or purple.
Those dark colors served a dual purpose during a chaotic time, didn't they?
They did. The succession process often required 2 simultaneous public events. You had the funeral procession for the deceased ruler and the enthronement ceremony for the heir. The dark fabrics satisfied the religious and cultural requirements for mourning.
But they were still high-quality garments.
Exactly. The extreme high quality of the silk and the cut of the dark kaftans ensured that the new sultan still visibly commanded imperial dignity. Once the 5-day period concluded, the new sultan would deliberately transition into lighter, vibrant colors.
Signaling the end of mourning.
Yes, and the official commencement of his independent reign.
To truly comprehend the power of these garments, we have to look closely at the materials themselves. The cut of a sleeve or the dark color of a mourning robe only holds power if the fabric itself is visibly superior to anything else in the world. We need to examine the actual mechanics of Ottoman textile production, starting with the Gulistan Kema.
Right. The Gulistan Kema represents the absolute pinnacle of 16th century Ottoman textile engineering. This specific type of silk fabric was reserved exclusively for the most important palace garments.
And what made it so special mechanically?
The defining characteristic of the Gulistan Kema is that it was woven using 8,000 individual warp threads.
Wait, 8,000. To understand the physical complexity of that, we have to look at how a manual loom operates. The warp threads are the vertical yarns held in tension on the loom, and the weaver passes the shuttle, carrying the horizontal weft threads back and forth through the warp.
Right, so managing 8,000 vertical warp threads on a pre-industrial manual loom requires a staggering level of mechanical complexity. They utilized massive draw looms.
How does one even operate that?
To operate a draw loom of this scale, a highly skilled assistant, known as a draw boy, sat physically on top of the loom apparatus. The draw boy's job was to manually pull specific sets of heavy cords that lifted hundreds of individual warp threads in a precise sequence for every single pass of the shuttle.
So you have a weaver below operating the shuttle and a draw boy above hauling heavy cords to lift 8,000 threads in perfect synchronization.
Exactly. The physical labor, the tension control required to prevent threads from snapping, and the spatial coordination needed to weave a complex floral pattern across 8,000 threads is a process that is nearly impossible to replicate with modern manual techniques.
That must have taken forever.
It required months of labor to produce just a few yards of fabric. The Gulistan Kemha was not just a piece of cloth, it was a physical manifestation of an empire that could concentrate immense labor and technological skill into a single object.
And the Ottoman textile industry that produced this fabric was heavily centralized and controlled by the state, primarily operating out of the city of Bursa.
Bursa functioned as the industrial heart of the Ottoman luxury silk trade. The state maintained strict regulatory oversight over every aspect of production. Inspectors monitored the quality of the raw silk thread imported from the Caspian Sea region, the number of threads used per square inch on the looms, and the specific chemical composition of the dyes.
The historical sources categorize the 3 main luxury fabrics produced under this system as Kemha, Saraser, and Ganife. Let's break those down.
Sure. We've discussed Kemha, which is the heavy silk brocade, often stiffened and reinforced with fine gold or silver wire woven into the top layer.
And cerasor.
Cerasor represents an even higher concentration of wealth. It is a fabric where the silk threads are entirely interwoven with a specialized wire made from a gold and silver alloy. A kaftan constructed from cerasor is physically heavy, weighing several pounds, and it shimmers constantly, reflecting light off the metallic threads.
And the third one, kadif.
Kadife is the Ottoman velvet. It was produced in various grades, sometimes plain, often woven with Debrew embossed patterns, and frequently interwoven with metallic threads to create a textured, three-dimensional surface.
The visual impact of the kemha, cerasor, and kadif relied heavily on their vibrant colors. Achieving these colors before the invention of synthetic dyes in the 19th century required vast agricultural supply chains and complex chemistry.
It did. The mastery of natural dyeing processes was a closely guarded state secret. The vibrancy and durability of Ottoman clothing depended entirely on the precise manipulation of organic materials.
So where did they get the colors?
To achieve the deep, saturated reds and oranges that characterize royal kaftans, dyers utilized madder root. The roots had to be harvested, dried, and ground into a powder, then boiled at specific temperatures to extract the alizarin compound.
And for the blues?
For rich, dark blues, they fermented the leaves of the indigo plant in massive vats. For vibrant yellows, they utilized the weld plant.
But extracting the color from a plant and boiling a piece of silk in it does not mean the color will stay in the fabric. Without a chemical binder, natural dyes will wash out or fade rapidly in the sun.
Right, and that brings us to the critical component in the dyeing process, the mordant. A mordant is a chemical substance that fixes the dye molecules to the physical fibers of the textile.
What did the Ottomans use?
The Ottoman industry primarily relied on alum as their mordant. When silk or wool is treated with an alum solution, the aluminum ions bond tightly with the protein structures of the fibers.
So it's literally altering the chemistry of the silk.
Exactly. When the fabric is subsequently placed in the dye vat, the dye molecules attach to the aluminum ions, creating a permanent chemical bridge. This chemical mastery allowed Ottoman textiles to maintain their brilliant, striking colors over decades of use and exposure to light.
Once the fabric was woven and permanently dyed, it was decorated with specific, highly regulated motifs. These were not arbitrary artistic choices, they were intentional symbols broadcasting state ideology. The most aggressive of these was the Sintamani motif.
The Sintamani motif is distinctive. It consists of 3 solid dots, typically arranged in a tight triangle, hovering over 2 long, wavy lines.
And where did that design come from?
The geometric design is an abstraction derived from leopard spots and tiger pelts.
So the imagery of predatory cats on the Central Asian steppes.
Exactly. The motif traveled westward with the Turkic tribes. When integrated into Ottoman court textiles, the Sintamani became the ultimate codified symbol of masculine power, brute physical strength, and absolute imperial sovereignty.
A very clear message.
Yes. When a sultan wore a kaftan covered in the Sintamani pattern, it was a visual declaration of predatory might. It signaled that the ruler possessed the strength of a tiger and the authority to strike down enemies.
But the sources show a sharp contrast to the predatory tiger stripes, with the heavy use of floral motifs, specifically the carnation.
The stylized carnation motif gained massive popularity in the 16th century, heavily influenced by the ceramic and tile workshops operating in the city of Iznik.
And what did it symbolize?
In the visual language of Ottoman clothing, the carnation symbolized eternal spring, physical renewal, and the lush, abundant gardens of Islamic paradise.
And alongside the carnation, we have the most famous Ottoman floral symbol, the tulip. The inclusion of the tulip went far beyond an appreciation for botany, right?
It did. The tulip held immense religious and linguistic significance. The visual appeal of the long, elegant petals was secondary to a specific linguistic property of the flower's name.
Oh, so?
Well, in the Arabic script used by the Ottomans, the word for tulip is lail. The specific Arabic letters used to spell lalam, aleph, lam, he can be rearranged to spell the word Allah.
Oh, wow. So weaving tulips into a garment was a continuous, subtle expression of religious devotion.
Exactly. A kaftan covered in tulips was viewed as being wrapped in divine blessing and protection.
So when you look at a single piece of 16th century Ottoman fabric,
Yeah.
You are looking at a masterclass in cultural synthesis.
The fabrics represent the deliberate construction of a uniquely Ottoman visual identity. A single kaftan might feature the Central Asian tiger stripes of the Sintamani, the Islamic calligraphy inherent in the tulip, and the complex brocade weaving techniques absorbed from Persian and Byzantine traditions.
Showing off their reach.
Right. The empire spanned multiple continents, absorbing diverse populations. By synthesizing these diverse artistic influences into their state-controlled textiles, the Ottoman elite communicated to any observer that they had conquered, absorbed, and mastered the cultural heritage of the known world.
The elite meticulously controlled their own image inside the Topkapi Palace, projecting this mastery and absolute power. But an empire cannot survive just by dressing up the sultan.
No, it can't.
The state needed to exert visible control over the streets, the marketplaces, and the general population. They achieved this by using clothing to enforce a rigid social hierarchy through comprehensive sumptuary laws.
And sumptuary laws are legal regulations issued by a government that strictly dictate what individuals are permitted to consume, purchase, or wear based on their social or religious standing.
And in the Ottoman Empire, these weren't just guidelines.
Not at all. They were not merely suggestions. They were foundational to maintaining public order and visible social stratification. The most significant and structurally rigid of these laws were codified during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566.
Suleiman's clothing regulations were directly tied to how the empire organized its population, a structure known as the millet system.
Yes, the millet system was the primary administrative framework of the empire. It organized the vast, diverse population into distinct, self-governing religious communities.
Like the Muslims, the Orthodox Christians.
Exactly, the Armenian Christians and the Jews as well. The sumptuary laws functioned as the physical manifestation of this administrative system. They ensured that the millet system was immediately visible to anyone walking down a street.
The regulations established under Suleiman were incredibly specific regarding color palettes and footwear. What exactly do the laws dictate?
The codes were legally binding and highly specific. Muslim men were designated by law to wear white turbans and yellow leather shoes. Furthermore, the color green was strictly reserved for the Muslim population, as it holds deeply sacred significance in Islam associated with the Prophet and paradise.
And the non-Muslim populations were heavily restricted in what they could wear.
Very restricted. The restrictions were designed to clearly separate the populations. Christians were legally restricted to wearing clothing of black or dark blue, and they were mandated to wear black headgear.
And the Jewish population?
Jewish men were required to wear red headgear and black shoes. Non-Muslims were entirely barred from wearing green-white turbans or yellow shoes.
Just instant identification.
Exactly. By legally enforcing these specific color palettes, the state ensured that the religious identity, and therefore the legal and social standing of any individual, could be accurately identified from a distance of several hundred yards.
The regulations went beyond just broad religious categories, though. The laws demanded that a man's specific profession and rank be visible at all times. The primary tool for this was the sarak, or the turban. It operated essentially as a mandatory visual CV.
The sarak was the ultimate marker of male professional and social identity. In Ottoman society, it was considered deeply shameful, almost akin to being undressed, for a man to appear in public bareheaded.
How was it constructed?
The turban was constructed by wrapping a length of fabric around a central cap. The volume of the fabric, the quality of the material, and the precise geometric style of the wrapping communicated exactly what a man did for a living and where he stood in the hierarchy.
So if we look at the religious scholars, the judges.
A judge, or a high-ranking member of the religious scholarly class known as the ulema, wore a massive, bulbous turban. The sheer volume of the white fabric was deliberately designed to signal the heavy accumulated weight of his legal and religious knowledge.
And the military.
A member of the elite Janissary military corps did not wear a wrapped turban. He wore a specific tall felt cap called a burk, which featured a piece of fabric hanging down the back to the waist.
And everyday people.
A standard merchant would wear a much simpler, smaller wrap of plain cotton. An observer could stand in a crowded Istanbul marketplace and immediately catalog the specific professions and ranks of every man present simply by looking at their heads.
When analyzing laws that dictate the exact color of shoes and the wrapping of hats across an empire spanning the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Europe, the question of enforcement arises. Did people actually obey these rigid color codes? or was there a constant struggle against them?
The historical reality is that the existence of the laws and the frequent need for sultans to reissue them tells us that people were constantly breaking them. The sociological concept at play here is status competition.
Meaning what exactly?
Well, sumptuary laws are frequently misunderstood as solely top-down oppression by a dictatorial state. In reality, these strict clothing laws are often heavily demanded by the existing elites.
So the elites are petitioning the Sultan to enforce the shoe colors. Why?
They demand enforcement during periods of economic mobility. If a non-Muslim merchant or a lower-class artisan becomes highly successful and accumulates wealth, his immediate instinct is to display that new wealth.
By buying the restricted clothes.
Yes, he does this by purchasing luxury silks, wearing prohibited bright colors, or adopting the large, complex turban styles reserved for higher ranks. This upward mobility terrifies the traditional elites.
Because it blurs the lines.
Exactly. If anyone with enough money can simply buy the visual markers of high status, the established hierarchy is undermined. The visual proof of the elite's superiority is blurred. Therefore, the old money and the established bureaucracy demand that the state strictly enforce the sumptuary laws to prevent this social blurring and protect their exclusive status.
We have a striking historical vignette regarding just how intensely this status competition was policed by the state. It involves Sultan Osman III, who reigned briefly from 1754 to 1757.
Osman III was infamous for his severe obsession with sartorial discipline and public morality. He viewed any deviation from the established clothing laws as a direct threat to state stability.
And he took it upon himself to check on this.
He did. During his reign, he would physically prowl the streets and marketplaces of Istanbul in disguise. He personally inspected the crowds, aggressively harassing and detaining citizens who were violating the minutiae of the clothing codes.
The consequences for violating these codes under leaders like Osman III were not just fines, they could be lethal. The sources highlight an extreme historical record concerning a Christian beggar.
The archives contain a documented case that perfectly illustrates the lethal severity of the sumptuary laws. A Christian beggar was arrested and subsequently executed by the state.
And his specific crime was simply wearing a pair of yellow slippers.
Yes. During his interrogation, it was revealed that the slippers had been given to him as a charitable donation by a Muslim passerby.
But because yellow footwear was strictly and legally reserved for Muslims.
Right. Despite the lack of malicious intent, he was put to death for the violation.
Executing a man over the color of donated shoes underscores that the state viewed clothing not as fashion, but as the foundational fabric of public order. Disrupting the visual hierarchy was treated as treason.
It really was.
This strict, color-coded system of visual separation lasted for centuries. But eventually, the empire faced a political crisis that forced a radical reset. This brings us to the most dramatic sartorial shift in Ottoman history, the Hat Revolution of 1829.
To understand the massive impact of the 1829 decree, we must set the political context of the early 19th century. The Ottoman Empire is struggling heavily.
Losing wars, dealing with economic decline.
Exactly. It's facing devastating military defeats from modernized European powers, primarily Russia, and it is dealing with severe internal fragmentation. Sultan Mahmud II recognizes that profound structural modernization of the military and the state bureaucracy is the only way the empire will survive.
But standing directly in the way of any modernization are the Janissaries.
The Janissary Corps, which began centuries earlier as an elite, disciplined fighting force, had devolved by the 19th century into a deeply conservative hereditary clique. They controlled the capital, they ran extortion rackets, and they violently opposed any attempts to reform the military or adopt modern tactics.
So Mahmud takes drastic measures.
In 1826, Mahmud II orchestrated a massive bloody suppression of the Janissaries. He turned his artillery on their barracks in Istanbul, destroying the corps entirely. This brutal consolidation of power is known as the Auspicious Incident.
With the primary conservative bloc destroyed, Mahmud II pushes his modernizing reforms forward, and his immediate target is the wardrobe of his own state officials.
Mahmud understood that to modernize the mechanics of the state, he had to modernize its physical appearance. The traditional clothing, the massive turbans, and the heavy layered robes represented the slow, bloated, and failing administrative practices of the past.
So what does he do?
In 1829, he issued a sweeping mandatory clothing decree. He completely abolished the turban, the voluminous robes, and the traditional slippers for all civil and military officials.
And replacing them with what?
In their place, he mandated tailored Western-style trousers, dark-fitted frock coats, and a completely new piece of headgear, the plain red fez.
The choice of the fez is highly specific. If he wanted to westernize the bureaucracy, why didn't he mandate a European top hat or a bowler hat?
The physical design of the fez was perfectly calibrated to align with Islamic requirements. It is a simple, brimless felt cap. The lack of a brim was the crucial factor.
Because of the daily prayers.
Yes. During the daily Islamic prayers, the Salah, a Muslim must physically touch their forehead directly to the ground during prostration. A European hat with a wide brim makes this physical act impossible without removing the hat entirely. The brimless design of the fez allowed the state officials to maintain their daily religious obligations while presenting a streamlined, modern, uniform silhouette.
But the introduction of the fez achieved something much more radical than just changing the silhouette. It fundamentally altered the social structure by introducing the concept of Ottomanism.
The 1829 decree was a deliberate attempt to forge a unified national identity. By mandating that all state officials must wear the identical plain red fez and the dark frock coat, regardless of whether they were Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, Mahmud II effectively erased centuries of religious visual hierarchy within the bureaucracy.
So under the old sumptuary laws of Suleiman, a single glance would tell you the religion and exact rank of an official.
Right. But after 1829, all officials looked uniform and equal before the Sultan. It was the visual language of modern, secularized citizenship.
So the Sultan introduces a hat designed to create equality and modernize the state. But the historical sources show intense, immediate resistance from the working class and the artisans. If the hat creates equality, why do the working class citizens reject it?
The artisans and workers rejected the plain red fez, but their resistance was not merely driven by stubborn religious conservatism. They rejected the hat as a visible form of political and economic protest.
Against what?
Mahmud II was not just changing clothes, he was implementing laissez-faire economic policies, opening the empire to cheap European manufactured goods, and actively dismantling the traditional trade guilds that had protected local artisans for centuries.
And those trade guilds had previously been closely allied with the Janissaries, whom the Sultan had just slaughtered.
Precisely. For the working class, the plain red fez and the dark frock coat were the uniform of the bureaucrats who were actively destroying their livelihoods.
So how did they resist?
The artisans responded by heavily modifying their headgear. While they were forced to adopt the fez, they continued to wrap thick lengths of cloth around it, mimicking the old turbans. They did this to maintain a clear, visible distinction between themselves and the state officials. They were using the modification of clothing to signal their absolute rejection of the Sultan's economic reforms.
To truly visualize this dramatic break with centuries of tradition, we have the image of Mahmud II stepping out into the Topkapi Palace courtyard just a week after the destruction of the Janissaries in 1826.
It's quite a scene. The behavior of prior sultans was heavily dictated by the clothing they wore. They were distant, inaccessible figures, heavily layered in traditional silk robes, often hidden behind lattice screens or moving slowly and deliberately. But on that day, Mahmud stepped into the main courtyard dressed entirely in a tailored European-style military uniform. He was presenting himself openly, to be seen clearly by the remaining troops and by foreign ambassadors. He fundamentally broke the tradition of the hidden, insulated ruler.
He used his own physical body, wrapped in modern, fitted tailoring, to signal that the old Ottoman order was dead and a new centralized era had begun.
Exactly.
While men's clothing was being aggressively dismantled and mandated by these top-down state decrees, women's fashion was undergoing its own complex organic evolution. The state repeatedly attempted to control female dress, but women's fashion was heavily influenced by increasing global contact, shifting social roles, and the physical demands of war. We transition now to the evolution of women's fashion and the westward gaze.
The 19th century, specifically the prolonged period of modernization and reform known as the Tanzimat era, brought profound structural changes to elite women's fashion. As the Ottoman Empire increased its diplomatic, economic, and cultural contact with Europe, Ottoman women in urban centers began actively adopting and adapting European fashion elements into their daily wardrobes.
We see a major structural shift away from the traditional Ottoman architecture of layering that we discussed earlier.
Yes. The fundamental shift in women's fashion was the advent of European-style tailoring. For centuries, female Ottoman clothing was defined by the high quality of the flat fabric, which was given shape only by draping and tying a belt around the waist.
So no actual shaping to the body itself.
Right. But during the Tanzimat era, women began wearing garments that were physically constructed to fit the specific contours of the body. They relied on complex seam work, darts, and structural tailoring to create the outfit, rather than just layering loose fabrics.
How did this structural shift manifest in the actual garments worn by elite women?
Women actively moved away from the traditional antari, which was the long, heavy, open-fronted robe worn indoors. They began adopting French square necklines, which were significantly lower cut than traditional garments.
And changing the colors too, right?
They traded the heavy, dark, traditional silks and brocades for lightweight fabrics and soft pastels. And crucially, for outerwear, they began wearing shorter, tailored overcoats that allowed for greater physical mobility.
This era of modernization also sees the arrival of a specific garment that became highly controversial and heavily debated, the sarshaf.
The history of the sarshaf is critical because it highlights how fashion migrates geographically and evolves structurally based on the needs of the wearers. The sarshaf made its first appearance in Istanbul in the early 1850s.
Where did it come from originally?
It originally came from the province of Syria, introduced to the capital by the wife of the Ottoman governor of Syria. In its initial regional form, it was a simple, voluminous one-piece garment that draped over the head and covered the wearer entirely down to the feet.
But once it arrived in the fashion-conscious capital of Istanbul, it did not remain a simple one-piece garment for long.
No, the urban women of Istanbul rapidly transformed it. By the late 19th and early 20th century, the sarshaf had evolved into a highly tailored, fashionable two-piece garment that closely resembled a chic European winter overcoat.
So what did that look like?
It featured internal belts positioned right below the chest to give it a defined shape. It was adorned with large, decorative glassy buttons, and it often featured expensive fur trim around the neck and the cuffs of the sleeves.
And the state apparatus was incredibly hostile to this evolution.
The conservative elements of the state repeatedly tried to ban this modern, tailored version of the sarshaf. They viewed it as too revealing, too European, and a breach of traditional modesty. They issued numerous decrees demanding that women return to wearing the traditional loose-fitting farace overcoat.
But the state bans failed repeatedly. Why did the bans fail if the state had the power to dictate clothing?
The bans failed due to a combination of female defiance and sheer economic reality. The state even had to formally lift one of its own bans because the producers and tailors of the sarshaf formally complained that they would go bankrupt if the garment was outlawed.
And there's a cost factor for the women too, right?
Exactly. The traditional faras required massive amounts of expensive silk. Working class and poor women simply could not afford it. The tailored sarshaf was more economical to produce. The women of Istanbul essentially ignored the state regulations, prioritizing fashion and economics, and continued wearing the tailored sarshaf.
This organic, gradual evolution of women's fashion accelerates massively due to the brutal realities of warfare. The impact of the Balkan Wars in the early 1910s, followed immediately by World War I, fundamentally altered women's physical roles in society and consequently their clothing.
Total warfare necessitates total pragmatism. During the Balkan Wars and World War I, unprecedented numbers of Ottoman men were conscripted and sent to the front lines. To keep the urban centers functioning and to maintain the wartime economy, Ottoman women entered the public workforce in numbers never seen before in the empire's history.
The sources mention women taking on heavy labor. They're working as tailors in military uniform factories, operating machinery, working as street cleaners, and even running barbershops.
When a woman is actively cleaning streets or operating heavy factory machinery for 10 hours a day, she cannot physically wear 6 layers of traditional restrictive garments or a heavy trailing overcoat.
It's just not physically possible.
Right. The practical physical demands of manual labor forced an immediate, radical change in clothing. Urban working women broadly adopted practical, Western-style urban clothing out of sheer necessity. The long trailing skirts, the complex waist sashes, and the heavy overcoats gave way to functional, shortened skirts and simple blouses that allowed for a full range of motion.
The analysis of this period points out a crucial nuance, though. Ottoman women were not just blindly copying the fashion houses of Paris or London. They were managing their appearance with a high degree of cultural awareness.
That is a vital distinction. Ottoman women actively synthesized European tailoring techniques with the enduring cultural requirements of Islamic modesty. They were constantly negotiating their own modern identity.
How did they strike that balance?
Well, an urban Ottoman woman in 1915 might wear a tailored European cut skirt and a functional blouse, but she would carefully pair it with a headscarf, tied in a specific, modern yet modest way. They actively curated their appearance to signal two things simultaneously:
Which were?
that they were modern, active participants in a globalizing world, and that they remained respectable, culturally grounded members of Ottoman society.
While they were adopting European tailoring, we also see the emergence of a brilliant, highly specific form of subtle, nonverbal communication in women's fashion through oil lace.
Ah, yes. Oya lace is a remarkably fine, intricate silk needle lace that emerged strongly in the early 19th century. Women utilized this delicate lace to heavily adorn the edges of their headscarves, collars, and undergarments.
But the oil lace was not merely a decorative trim. The specific colors chosen and the specific floral patterns woven into the lace function as a highly complex, coded language among women. How exactly did that code function in daily life?
Because direct verbal expression of emotion or dissatisfaction was often socially restricted for women, they spoke through the lace. A young woman could communicate her current emotional state, her marital status, her hopes for the future, or her social intentions based entirely on the specific floral pattern of lace she chose to wear on her headscarf that day.
So they're literally wearing their thoughts.
Exactly. A certain flower woven in yellow might indicate unhappiness in a marriage, while a different pattern in red might signal a desire for pregnancy. It was a private, female-dominated language that was worn entirely in the public sphere, completely unreadable to those who did not know the code.
We conclude this deep dive by examining the reciprocal relationship between the Ottomans and the West. Because while the Ottomans in the 19th century were increasingly looking westward for tailoring and military technology, Europe had spent centuries obsessed with looking eastward.
They certainly had.
The empire strikes back, culturally speaking, and we will look at the final, deeply ironic fate of the fez.
The cultural influence heavily flowed in both directions. The traditional Ottoman architecture of layering, the use of front-opening coats, and the importation of luxurious, brightly dyed silk textiles deeply influenced European fashion for centuries. This cultural obsession culminated in the 18th century with the massive European cultural movement known as Turkery.
Turkery was essentially a widespread European craze for all things visually associated with the Ottoman Empire.
Driven by increased diplomatic contact, trade, and the publication of travel narratives, European elites developed a massive fascination with Ottoman aesthetics. They hosted extravagant masquerades and court balls where the European nobility dressed in pseudo-Ottoman attire.
Even their everyday wear was influenced, right?
Yes. European tailors began imitating the loose, bifurcated trousers of the shalvar, and they adopted the layered, front-opening construction of the kaftan to create new styles of European robes. While the European adoption was often a superficial imitation, prioritizing an idea of exoticism over the actual physical function of the garments, it proves that Ottoman fashion held immense cultural and visual power over the European imagination.
But back inside the empire, as the 19th century draws to a close, the tension between westernization and traditional Islamic identity reaches a boiling point. The state pushes back against the Western gaze.
Sultan Abdulhamid II ascended to the throne in the late 19th century and actively sought to reassert the traditional Islamic character of the empire. He recognized the empire was weakening, and he emphasized his role not just as the Ottoman Sultan, but specifically as the Caliph, the spiritual leader of the entire global Islamic world.
And he used clothing to make this point.
As part of this reactionary political move away from westernization, he utilized clothing laws. In 1877, he issued a strict ban prohibiting Ottoman citizens from wearing brimmed European hats.
To protect the fez.
Exactly. He wanted to preserve the fez, which had been mandated 50 years earlier, as the absolute, undisputed marker of an Ottoman Muslim-centric identity.
Which brings us to the final fatal blow for Ottoman clothing. The Ottoman Empire collapses after World War I, and out of the ashes, the modern Republic of Turkey is founded by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And Atatürk has his own very specific ideas about the political power of hats.
Atatürk was determined to construct a thoroughly secular, Western-facing, modernized nation-state. He viewed any visible remnants of the Ottoman Islamic legacy as dangerous obstacles to the modernization of the new republic. He targeted the clothing of the population to force a cultural break with the past.
So what did he do?
On November 25th, 1925, the Turkish government passed the hat law. This specific law strictly outlawed the wearing of the fez in all public places, mandating that it be replaced entirely with Western-style broomed hats, such as fedoras or bowler hats.
And people resisted this, obviously.
The law was enforced brutally by the state, in some documented cases utilizing the death penalty to crush local resistance to the hat changes.
Let's examine the timeline of this single piece of felt. It took less than a century for the ultimate symbol of the future to become the ultimate symbol of the past. It shows how quickly the shifting political context dictates the meaning of the fabric we wear on our bodies.
That timeline represents the profound 96-year paradox of the fez. When Sultan Mahmud II introduced the plain red fez in 1829, it was deployed as a radical, secularizing tool of Western modernity.
Right, to replace the turban.
It was specifically designed to strip away the old, entrenched religious hierarchies of the turban and modernize the bureaucracy. When it was introduced, it was despised by traditional conservatives. Yet exactly 96 years later, in 1925, Atatürk legally banned the exact same hat because the political reality around it had inverted.
It had become what it initially fought against.
Exactly. By 1925, the fez had come to represent the complete opposite of modernity. It was viewed by the new republic as the backward, religious, failed symbol of the Ottoman past. The physical construction of the felt cap never changed a single thread, but the political context around it completely inverted its meaning and resulted in its destruction.
Consider how modern institutional dress codes function today. A dark corporate suit on Wall Street, or the deliberate, expensive casualness of a tech CEO's hoodie in Silicon Valley function mechanically identical to the Ottoman sumptuary laws of Suleiman the Magnificent. They are unwritten, visual CVs designed to instantly signal access, enforce social hierarchy, and protect the exclusive status of the elite. They prove that while we may have traded the heavy silk caftan and the strict color codes for modern tailoring, we are still wearing our power for everyone to see. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.